Hello, welcome to PCAP's fifth Prairie's Got the Goods Week. My name is Caitlin Moreau-Seiler, and I am the Stewardship Coordinator with Saskatchewan Prairie Conservation Action Plan, or PCAP. This is the first of 6 webinars that we are hosting this week. Today, Dave Mache from the U.S. Geological Survey Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center will be speaking about quantifying ecosystem services derived from wetlands, the Integrated Landscape Modeling Partnership. I'd like to start by stating we respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional territories of many Indigenous nations and communities, past and present. For millennia, they have worked to protect these landscapes and the life these areas sustain. I would like to thank these original caretakers and acknowledge the ongoing work and presence of Indigenous peoples in Canada today. I would like to note this presentation is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the PCAP YouTube channel in the near future. As part of Prairie's Got the Goods Week, there will be 2 webinars going on tomorrow. Join us for a presentation at 12 p.m. about retaining Canada's grasslands using carbon offsets, and at 3 p.m. for a presentation about the ecological goods and services provided by the native prairie ecosystem from an Indigenous perspective. For more information about these webinars or to register, just visit the PCAP website. You can click on upcoming events and then Prairie's Got the Goods Week for a full schedule. Prairie's Got the Goods Week would not be possible without our sponsors. I would like to sincerely thank our presenting sponsors, Sask Energy and Wildlife Habitat Canada, as well as our supporting sponsors, Eco-Friendly Sask and Saskatchewan Cattlemen's Association. In-kind support is provided by the U.S. Geological Survey. A reminder to all of our listeners out there, you'll be muted for the duration of the webinar. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type it into the questions section of the webinar dashboard at any time during the presentation. And if you are on the cell phone app, you can send your question by chat to the organizer, and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Now, a bit about today's presenter. David Mache is a research wildlife biologist and chief of the Climate and Land Use Branch at the Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center in Jamestown, North Dakota. Dr. Mache's research is focused principally on prairie pothole wetland ecosystems of the Northern Great Plains and has included topics such as the provisioning of ecosystem services, the development of complex system models, and the influences of changing environmental drivers, for example, climate and land use, on wetland ecosystem processes. In his role as chief of the Climate and Land Use Branch, Dave supervises several other research scientists working together to meet the science information needs of the Department of the Interior and other partner agencies and organizations. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to you, Dave.
Okay, I'll get things going here. There, you should be seeing my screen now. Is that correct, Caitlin?
Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Thank you, Caitlin. So as Caitlin mentioned, I'm a U.S. geoscience. I work out of the Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center in Jamestown, North Dakota, and I serve as the chief of the Climate Land Use Change Branch. But I also lead the USGS portion of what we call the Integrated Landscape Modeling Partnership. Now, the Integrated Landscape Modeling Partnership, it's an effort focused on identifying, testing, and developing models to assist with the quantification and the valuation of services provided by natural ecosystems. That is the ecosystem services. In 2016, a report was put out describing the Integrated Landscape Modeling Partnership, its accomplishments, and its future directions. And that report, the cover of it is shown on the right-hand side of the screen, along with a link. And all of these links I'll be putting up at the end of the presentation, so you don't have to jot them down too quickly here if you're interested in obtaining these publications. I did want to mention that a major update for this report is also in progress, and it's due out by the end of the calendar year. So by December of this year, there should be a major update to that report that will include a lot more services and really bring the ILM effort up to speed in terms of what we've accomplished. So while the ILM, I'm just going to be calling it the ILM partnership now rather than integrated landscape modeling, because that's quite the mouthful. So the ILM partnership, it's being conducted across multiple regions of the U.S. The integrated ecosystem services modeling effort has been focused primarily in the Prairie Pothole region of the upper Midwest. So while a lot of evaluations are being done in other areas of the country, really most of the modeling focus is on the Prairie Pothole region. And as you all are well aware, this area extends well up into the Canadian provinces of Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. And the focus of the Prairie Pothole region portion of the ILM has been primarily due to its availability of data, given that the regional assessment, it was one of the first ones to be implemented due to the importance of this region to crop production and other ecosystem services. And a big one of those is wildlife. So as many of you are aware, that well over half of all ducks produced in North America each year come from the Prairie Pothole region. So it's a very important area. The Prairie Pothole region regional assessment identified and quantified a suite of ecosystem services derived from wetlands, primarily those within crop fields. These included services such as aquifer recharge, flood control, sediment retention, nutrient regulation, carbon sequestration, and the support of biodiversity. However, the original assessment work was published as a U.S. professional paper. It's professional paper 1745. It didn't really go into providing a means to readily identify the multiple services in a manner that's useful for identifying trade-offs. This original work done in 1997 and then extending up into 2004 really collected a lot of the underlying data that was been extremely useful for model development, but it was really at that data collection effort, not so much getting into the actual quantification and looking at trade-offs. And when you start talking about trade-offs, this photo here is a good example. It shows a crew out measuring the production of greenhouse gases emanating from a prairie pothole wetland. And if one really wanted to maximize the sequestration of carbon in the anoxic soils of wetlands, you'd want a wetland that looks something like this, the one pictured here. Thick vegetative growth growing across the entire basin. Pulling in that carbon from the atmosphere, converting it to vegetated matter, then fully saturated conditions with the soils so you don't get any aerobic respiration going on, and that carbon is breaking down very slowly and eventually would form peat, be sequestered underground. However, such a wetland would be likely to have much lower value as waterfowl habitat than, say, the one pictured here with this interspersion of open water areas where ducks can loaf and feed out in the open water. So there are trade-offs. To increase a wetland's ability to store carbon, we want to tie that carbon up in dense mats of wetland vegetation in that anaerobic environment to facilitate peat formation. But this process can have a negative influence on other services valued by society if taken to the extreme. Thus, the ILM partnership was formed. This partnership brought together individuals with a common goal of developing methodology to quantify ecosystem services in a manner that would facilitate the identification and quantification of important trade-offs. After reviewing multiple modeling approaches, the ILM partnership settled on a methodology that combines two distinct modeling types. First, a geospatial model. We're currently using a model called InVEST. It stands for the Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs. And it uses land cover layers in a GIS environment to quantify services. Then we also use a process-based model. And again, we're currently using Apex for that process-based approach. So InVEST is used in modeling services that depend upon the spatial configuration and availability of landscape components. For example, the distance to a breeding wetland might be an important factor to an amphibian. Thus, most of the services modeled using InVEST are habitat related. By contrast, Apex is used to model process-based services such as the storage of floodwaters, sediment entrapment, and processes that lead to the reduction of nutrient runoffs from croplands. So this dual model approach that we've taken in the integrated landscape modeling effort allows for the quantification of a greater number of services and be possible using either model type alone. also allows for the identification of trade-offs among those services. Now on this slide here, you'll see on the right some of the services that we've been modeling using both InVEST and the Apex model. But let's first explore InVEST a little bit further. So as I mentioned, InVEST stands for the Integrated Valuation of Ecosystem Services and Trade-offs, and it's an open source geospatial modeling system developed and available from the Natural Capital Project. The model's scenario-based, which is ideal for the ILM effort, as we are able to evaluate the influence of conservation practices by modeling scenarios of a landscape, both with and without a particular practice or a suite of practices in place. So we can take something like providing a buffer strip around a wetland, and we can model the landscape with those wetland buffer strips currently on the ground, or we can go in and we can take them off, convert them back to cropland in that modeling environment and see what sort of a difference we get when we have either buffers around wetlands or not. And this is really of use to agencies like the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and I'm sure up in Canada, your agricultural agencies as well, spend huge amounts of money in terms of conservation of going out on the land. So, providing funds to plant buffer strips around wetlands, or making payments to have a landowner put perennial cover back on the ground to help protect the wetlands or the prairies or the ecosystem services that are being generated from those. So as I mentioned, the InVEST model, it's a geospatial model, relies on land cover layers to describe the landscape. This slide shows some of the many layers that are merged together to form the landscape we use to model amphibian habitat in the Prairie Pothole region. This work was published in 2014. You'll notice the layers identified include CRP and WRP. So those are actual specific to the U.S. Department of Agriculture. CRP is the Conservation Reserve Program, and they pay farmers to take some lands out of production and to plant them to perennial cover, such as grasses. And the Wetland Reserve Program is similar to CRP, but it has a focus on wetlands, but also returning some of the land surrounding the wetlands back to grassland habitat. So we've done quite a bit of this modeling work, was supported by USDA because they wanted to know what sort of benefits they're getting from all the conservation practices they're putting out on the landscape. And by using the InVEST model and also Apex, it allows us to run scenarios in which we could evaluate the influence of these conservation lands on habitats. Similarly, layers can be developed for waterfowl, grassland birds, pollinators, in addition to the amphibian habitat model that I already discussed. And it can be done either at a species level or at a broader grouping, such as was done with amphibians. We considered amphibians as a broad group rather than down at the species level. It's all depending on what sort of information you're trying to get at, and also the detail of data you have to feed into the model, how much you know about the habitat requirements for a specific species or group of species. So lookup tables are an essential component of the InVEST model. These tables are populated with information that identifies land cover categories that are habitat for a species of interest. And this table is known as the susceptibility table because it also includes information on threats to those habitats and how susceptible the habitats are to degradation by a specific type of threat. Another table identifies the distance of influence of a threat and how that threat decays as distance from the threat increases. As you move further and further away from a threat, does the threat influence decay linearly or perhaps at an exponential rate? Some of the threats identified for amphibian habitats included croplands with their associated runoff of agrochemicals, permanent waters that could harbor fish, wetland ponds that dried too quickly and also those that were isolated. So a wetland does not function as an amphibian habitat if it is so isolated from other wetlands that populations become disconnected. So running the InVEST model, it incorporates that background information, that we know about a lot of species on what's their habitat, what the threats to those habitats are, and then also how those specific threats affect the value of that habitat for a species. Now, the U.S. portion of the Prairie Pothole region can be divided into 4 distinct ecoregions: northern glaciated plains, the northwestern glaciated plains, the Lake Agassiz Plains, and the Des Moines Lobe. So the next several slides I'm going to focus on are going to be some InVEST modeling runs that we conducted for the Des Moines Lobe ecoregion of south central Minnesota, north central Iowa. So they're the areas that are identified on this map as DML, that portion down in the very the bottom right portion of the area outlined in green here. And so you can kind of see that same Des Moines Lobe area reproduced on these insets in this amphibian habitat map. So in this effort, we ran 2 scenarios, one with the landscape in its current condition, and then a second scenario in which all of the conservation land that was currently in the USDA's Wetland Reserve Program had its land cover type changed from its current mixture of wetlands and surrounding grassland back to a crop type. From this scenario, we found that the Wetlands Reserve Program is providing over 27,000 hectares of habitat for amphibians. So this is in an area where the quality of amphibian habitat is currently very rare, since over 90% of the wetland area in the Des Moines Lobe has been drained and 99% of its native tallgrass prairie habitat has been lost. So it's been an extremely disturbed area. So providing 27,000 hectares of habitat through this Wetland Reserve Program can have a very significant effect on the amphibian populations as a whole. Then this is looking at what's happening in terms of carbon being stored in the soils. So here we can see that over 300,000 metric tons of carbon are being stored in the wetlands and grassland soils of these CRP grasslands. On these slides, the best spot to look to really see the difference is what I have highlighted in red in the lower right-hand corner. That's showing really the change that's occurring between the 2 views. So between A and B, it might be hard to see any difference there, but when you get down to onto the ground, there's a huge difference in the amount of carbon that's being stored between those 2 scenarios. Okay, now if that were carbon that was being released into the atmosphere, as would occur if the land was returned to crop production, the cost to society would exceed $38 million. So this is using a societal cost of CO2 from the Government Accounting Office. That's the U.S. government's accounting office. They figure the societal cost of releasing CO2 in the atmosphere at about $34 per metric ton. This $34 estimate, though, may be quite low, as a recent Stanford report has estimated that the true cost could be upwards of $200 per metric ton. So when the U.S. government does their cost-benefit analyses, currently they're using the $34 figure, but it's more likely, quite a bit more than that. Harm that would happen to society if Wetland Reserve Program here went away and all that carbon was released back into the atmosphere if those lands were put back into production. So when we started working with the InVEST model, it did not really have a module for managed bees, for honeybees on the landscape. Thus, as part of the ILM partnership, we worked with the originators of the InVEST model, the ones who developed the native bee model, to develop a model for honeybees. This model rates the quality of the floral resources in an area, both in terms of the nectar needed for honey production and the pollen needed for bee nutrition. That nutrition that allows bees from the upper Midwest to be shipped all across the nation to provide pollination services. So one of the big areas that bees from North Dakota and the upper Midwest go is to California, where they pollinate an almond crop. With the InVEST model, so we get a total rating of the floral resources during a growing season. The purple, this is a zoom in area showing where we did some of the validation work for the model that was developed for honeybees in InVEST. So we get a total rating of the floral resources during a growing season. And the purple dots show the location of apiaries, apiaries, so the honeybee colonies that were actually used for the model validation. At each of these purple points, we had very detailed information on the honey production that was coming from colonies, and we could use that to get a rating in terms of what was available for floral resources and see how well our model was working. And actually we found it to be a very nice fit. So we were really capturing, where those floral resources were on the landscape. But we can also view how those floral resources for bees change across the season. So here we have that same landscape in spring, going into the summer, and then into the fall. And so you can look and see how floral resources are changing over time for your bees on the landscape. So then it takes those three, spring, summer, and fall values, and it combines the three layers to provide the overall quality rating for the area that covers the entire period that the honeybees are dependent on the floral resources of the landscape. So on the map shown here, the warmer, redder colors indicate high quality areas in terms of floral resources available to pollinators, while the cooler colors represent lower quality areas. Again, the purple dots are those actual honeybee apiary locations where we have multiple years of honey production records that were used to validate our model results. So now zoom back out to that larger scale of the Des Moines lobe ecoregion, we see that the Des Moines lobe provided over 34,000 hectares of high quality floral resources for the region's pollinators. So that's WRP in the Des Moines lobe that was providing those resources. If that program were to go away, similar for carbon and the amphibians, those benefits would be lost. Those floral resources would be, converted to corn, soybeans, and other things, not nearly as much value to honeybee production, honey production, and also honeybee health. We also see a large increase in the presence of high quality wetland native plant communities from the influence of the Wetlands Reserve Program on the landscape. So this is another measure that we have in the InVEST model. It gives us a quality rating in terms of the native plant communities. It's tied very closely to a methodology called floristic quality assessment that applies different ratings to plants based on how well they handle disturbance. And so plants that they can exist in almost any habitat type in a tilled field and all, they get a very low value, but those that only exist in the highest quality native prairie, they get a very high value. And from that, you get an overall floristic quality rating. And with the InVEST model, we can actually model what that habitat would look like in terms of floristic quality without actually going out on the land and recording the different plant species that are there. And like I'd mentioned before, the Wetlands Reserve Program doesn't focus solely on wetland areas. Most wetlands in the program also include areas of grassland buffers. These grasslands associated with the wetland areas provided by the program are responsible for the addition of over 25,000 hectares of habitat for grassland birds, a group of birds that have been seeing marked declines in recent years, for which there has been much concern. So one way that we can then take all this and view it together is through the use of what we call spoke and wheel diagrams. This shows the conditions of services depicted in the previous slides in a single diagram. The view is of those services under scenario without the influence of WRP. So this is the landscape with no WRP land on it. That is, all of the WRP lands in the Des Moines lobe, they've been returned to crop production in our model. And this figure depicts those same areas with the influence of WRP is intact. As you can see, the changes appear moderate, but in this region of greatly impacted ecosystem, even moderate changes can have big impacts to wildlife populations and other landscape associated services. Then when you add on the influence of other conservation programs, such as the Conservation Reserve Program, the changes can be much more substantial. So just one more look. This is without WRP on the landscape, and then with WRP. Now you've probably noticed that there have been no change at all as shown in this set of services representing water storage, water quality improvement, sediment entrapment. And that's because the InVEST model does not account for these process-based services. For those, we use the Agricultural Policy Extender Model, or the name most of you know it by, APEX. I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with APEX. It is a primary model along with SWOT used by what's called the Conservation Effects Assessment Project of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So CEAP, as it is more commonly known, Conservation Effects Assessment Project, is an effort by the Department of Agriculture to quantify the effects of the different conservation programs and practices that they're putting out on the landscape. They have different components. There's a CEAP wetlands, which I'm a close part of. There's CEAP croplands, CEAP grazing lands, and CEAP wildlife. So CEAP croplands is really the ones that use APEX a lot to monitor how changes in conservation practices on croplands affect loss of sediments and runoff of nutrients and agrochemicals at that edge of field. However, the effect of wetlands in the crop field is currently not considered in the CEAP cropland assessments. Thus, the Integrated Landscape Monitoring Partnership, we've been working very closely with the USDA modeling team located in CEAP, Texas, doing the CEAP croplands modeling work. We've been working with them to develop the methodology needed to incorporate wetlands into the cropland assessments. So this recently published paper describes the framework that we're using. I wanted to point out that Owen McKenna, he's the lead author on this paper. He's also a U.S. geoscientist at Northern Prairie, and he's deeply involved with the overall modeling efforts, primarily focused on the APEX modeling. So basically, with our work with APEX, we take the standardized 16-hectare field that is being used by CEAP cropland assessments, and we partition out a portion of the field that corresponds to the area of wetlands, plus the portion of field that flows into the wetland basin. So in this case, the wetland area is that small square of soil series B shown in the lower right corner of figure B on this graph, on this figure. The area that drains into and through this wetland is the portion of soil series A, located just above the wetland. The area sizes are based on a standardized relationship between wetland area and catchment size that was developed through that earlier CEAP wetlands research effort that I mentioned at the very beginning of this presentation. So if you zoom in on just that wetland and wetland catchment portion of the standardized field, we see that the field is subdivided further, which allows us to simulate where the entire wetland catchment is cropped, as shown on the left, or one in which a grassland buffer is added around the wetland, or lastly, one in which the entire catchment is planted to a perennial cover. Using these three basic configurations, we can then compare the treatments to results from the original standardized field without any wetland features in it. Again, that is taking that with and without practice approach. So that's what this graph is showing. The bars on the graph show changes in the amount of water on the left, dissolved nitrogen in the center, and dissolved phosphorus on the right, leaving a simulated field. The left bar in each group shows the reduction in these edge of field losses if just the wetland area is added. The central bars showed reduction with a buffer added, and the right bar in each group is with the entire catchment returned to perennial cover. So as you can see, in terms of reduction in edge of field water losses, the biggest gains come when the entire catchment is returned to grass. However, large reductions in nutrient losses occur even when just the wetland is added. So there's really not a statistical difference, between the adding a wetland or wetland with a buffer strip or wetland with an entire catchment and grassland when we're looking at dissolved nitrogen and dissolved phosphorus. But we can also look at the effect of to the wetland itself. One of the most significant findings of CEAP wetlands has been related to quantifications of how quickly wetlands can fill with sediments and effectively lose their ability to function and provide the services we value. This has been best quantified in the playa wetlands by CEAP wetlands team lead, Dr. Lauren Smith, working out of Oklahoma State University. But back to our Prairie Pothole Region data, Here, the top graph shows that there is a great reduction in the water, nitrogen, and phosphorus entering the wetland when a buffer is added. This increases more if the entire catchment is allowed to function as a buffer. Thus, more water and nutrients are being retained in the uplands where we want them. Additionally, the bottom graph shows reductions in sediments, labeled here as total, and the nitrogen and phosphorus absorbed to those sediments. The key is that a buffer can greatly increase the sustainability of a wetland to function by reducing sedimentation, filling it up by about 70%. Returning the catchment to grassland results in almost 100% reduction in the movement of sediments from the upland to the wetland basin. This is why wetlands and natural grasslands have been on the prairie since the retreat of the last glaciers over 14,000 years ago. It also shows us how quickly these wetlands can be lost to sediment infilling without some sort of a buffer. So the buffers around the wetlands are returning the catchment to grassland is what really increases the sustainability of wetlands to continue to provide services over time. So this paper here describes our apex modeling framework and other papers that are presenting recent results from steep wetlands work. They were published in a special section of the journal Soil and Water Conservation. The paper describing our apex modeling work was one of these papers, and it's in that special section. And I'll be providing a link to the special section of that journal at the end of my presentation. But within the special section of the journal Soil and Water Conservation issue, we have multiple papers from the SEEP wetlands effort that describe the recent advances and findings, not just from the Prairie Pothole region, but from some of the other SEEP wetland assessment efforts that were done in the lower Mississippi Alluvia Valley, the playas I mentioned with Lauren Smith and his group out of Oklahoma, and Midwest, actually the Eastern Coastal Plains work, and also the Central Valley of California. And this is the link to another modeling system. So while InVEST and APEX are the primary models being used by the ILM partnership within SEEP wetlands, at the USGS, we've also developed a third model that is used to fill the gap between InVEST and APEX. So this is the Pothole Hydrology Link System Simulator, a model that we affectionately refer to as PHYLLIS, given that it was developed using a systems modeling software named Stella. So PHYLLIS, Stella, those are types of things that we scientists seem to be amused by. I think we're easily amused. So this is a very generalized view of the PHYLLIS model and how it simulates wetland processes. But I want to use this more complex wiring diagram, even though it is complex. What I want to point out are the circles along the left-hand side. So these are the model inputs and include things like air temperature, daily precipitation, catchment area, wetland area, spill point elevation, and others. Using these inputs, the model simulates buildup of a snowpack in the winter, melting of that snow when temperatures rise, runoff inputs from snowmelt and summer rains. Once the soil volume square shown in the middle there is filled, water begins to accumulate as ponded water in the wetland. This is quantified in the pool volume rectangle. I want to highlight this small area. Don't know if my pointer's working here. Well, anyway, once the soil volume square is filled here in the middle is filled, water begins to accumulate in the ponded water in the wetland. This is where water spills from the wetland is being quantified. But there's also a spill-in component, which allows us to add in water spilling from an upstream wetland. With this, we can link together multiple models forming a complex with upgradient wetlands spilling water into lower elevation wetlands when conditions are right. Another key feature is shown in the lower right-hand corner in red. So this portion of the model quantifies the concentration of dissolved salts in the ponded water and in the soil. Now, this is key to simulating other components of the wetland system tied to salinity changes. Using the hydrology and water chemistry components currently in the PHYLLIS model, we are now working to add the ability to simulate biotic components such as the plant communities, the aquatic invertebrates, and ultimately the vertebrates such as waterfowl. And this is really where that salinity component comes in, because salinity can have such a limiting effect on some invertebrates, and it also can promote other invertebrates that are highly salt tolerant. And one of our newest scientists at Northern Prairie is Dr. Kyle McLean. He has been developing structural equation models that will be added to PHYLLIS to give us the ability to model those biotic components. This structural equation model shows a relationship among many of the components currently in PHYLLIS and how they influence the biotic components of the system, in this case, the composition of the macroinvertebrate communities. This model was focused on the drivers of the invertebrate communities, and they're shown at the bottom of the figure here. So what the PHYLLIS model will do is give us the ability to have a much better informed information on wetland processes needed to better inform our inputs into both the InVEST model in terms of identifying habitats and threats to those habitats, and also to the APEX model in terms of the processes influencing water runoff to and the losses from wetland systems. Thus, from the integrated landscape monitoring perspective, PHYLLIS will fit between InVEST and the APEX models in our overall ecosystem service modeling framework. Now, this brings us back to the issue of identifying and quantifying trade-offs, information that's needed to inform decision makers. And we are now able to split the water storage, water quality, sediment entrapment spoke into multiple spokes with PHYLLIS facilitating better estimates of conservation outcomes as quantified by InVEST and APEX. So I'd like to conclude with a short preview of where USGS science is heading and the benefits that this can bring to our modeling of ecosystem services in a way that will provide quantifications at what they call the speed needed by decision makers. So this is a quote from former USGS Director Jim Riley, in which he introduced EarthMap. And when you read this quote, it sounds a whole lot like what we are doing with the Integrated Landscape Monitoring Partnership. The Integrated Landscape Modeling Partnership has set a base in place for the real-time modeling envisioned for EarthMap. We have been working in each of the three bubbles that intersect with EarthMap. EarthMap will combine advanced cloud computing capabilities with unlimited data storage in a way that will allow analysis and quantifications to be done in real time as data is downloaded directly from satellites and other data streams. The quantification of ecohydrology and ecosystem services is one of the first use cases being implemented in the EarthMap system. And the goals of what EarthMap should do are perfectly aligned with the goals of the Integrated Landscape Modeling Partnership. It is this last bullet that I find most exciting. The new sensors, artificial intelligence, and cloud computing capabilities that EarthMap will bring to our efforts are what will allow us to reach that goal of providing information to decision makers at the speed of decisions. The EarthMap vision is to provide information in hours or minutes rather than months and years. But we're not there yet. EarthMap is currently in the formulation stage, but the ecosystem service work is being pushed forward by the U.S. But the ecosystem work is being pushed forward by the USGS and will hopefully be one of the first implemented projects and deployed, given the large amount of work that's already been accomplished by the partnerships between USDA and the USGS through the SEEP Wetlands and the Integrated Landscape Modeling Partnership. So I would just like to conclude by once again providing some of the links to the publications describing the Integrated Landscape Modeling Partnership, the release of the PHYLLIS model, and that special issue of the Journal of Soil and Water Conservation that includes a special section on the Integrated Landscape Modeling effort. So with that, I thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed this webinar. And I'm not sure if we can do questions or not, but I'm free to try and answer any that come in.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the really informative and interesting presentation. A lot of webinar attendees have typed in about how they found it's very interesting, influential. That's an amazing presentation. So there's lots of comments coming in there. So thank you very much. One of our listeners does have a question. To all of our listeners, if you have any questions, just type it into the question section of the webinar dashboard, or I'll send it through chat to the organizer. So a listener named Anna Maria is wondering if there is an InVEST MOOC that she can look for. Do you have any comments about that?
Uh, an MOOC. I'm not sure what that is standing for.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. Anna Marina, if you're still on the line, feel free to type that in there.
If she's looking
We'll
for
just,
where to obtain the model,
oh, she
just look
says like an
under.
open course, like a
Oh
free
yes,
open course.
yes. So the Natural Capital Project is the one that puts out the invest. So you can just search for Natural Capital Project. Google that and you'll come up to their web page, and that's where you can get a free download of the invest model. They have all sorts of documentation, plus they do have training sessions that they do on the invest model, and so that
Perfect.
is available. And they also, once a year, they have a annual get together, a symposium on it as well. It's been virtual this last year, but it's another great resource if you can attend that. So lots of resources to
Excellent.
learn invest.
Yes, excellent. That sounds like a great resource. And Anna Maria's typed in, thank you. There's been some listeners wondering if this presentation's being recorded. Yes, it is. You can check out the PCAP YouTube channel. Later today, it'll be uploaded there probably as fast as my internet will let me. And you're welcome to share it with anyone who wasn't able to make it to the live presentation. And yeah, we'll just give people another minute to type in any questions if they have any. I guess I just wanted to ask you, um, how do you, in North Dakota, how much native prairie is left there, and how do you get people to realize the value of wetlands? It's more than, and I guess draining is a huge issue here. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're trying to do through promoting ecosystem services. So, in throughout the prairie potholes, people have always seen the value of wetlands in terms of waterfowl and waterfowl production. But as the hunting community gets smaller and smaller, the support for wetland preservation just based off of waterfowl production is gets less and less as well. And so by looking at it in terms of ecosystem services, you get a much broader view of what those systems are providing. So we can look at how it's reducing floodwater flows in like the Red River, and perhaps could lower flood damage in areas like Grand Forks, that have had some major flooding issues. And we can look at how they store carbon and how they provide services for terms of water quality improvement. So trying to get a broader group of society in support of wetland preservation by showing that it does affect them, that there's, if you have enough
Mhm.
services that are coming from these that you can show, you're bound to have somebody say, oh yeah, that is a value to me. So that's kind of the approach of the ecosystem service approach. There is
Yeah,
not a,
that makes sense.
in terms of native prairie, we've lost, oh, well over 50% of our native prairies, especially far more in the eastern part of the state of North Dakota, where it's probably around 99% in the Red River Valley, because it's such fertile soils. But out west, there's much more cattle grazing that have helped to maintain the grass on the landscape.
Wow, wow. We
And
have a few questions. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
that, I'm sure you're facing now up in Canada that loss of prairies and wetlands, like we already went through our big loss of it down here, especially down in Iowa. That Des Moines lobe area I showed, they've been doing
Yeah,
tile drainage and stuff there. So like I said, they've lost over 90% of their wetlands, and what used to be all tall grass prairie there, and only about 1% of the tall grass prairie remains.
wow, wow. There's a couple questions here about the National Wetland Inventory. A listener named Jim is wondering if you can give perspective on how important the National Wetland Inventory has been to your efforts.
It's been very important because one of the data layers we use is called the cropland data layer, but it doesn't do a good job capturing those smaller wetlands that occur in the National Wetland Inventory. And so one of the layers we do bring in is the National Wetland Inventory data to capture those small wetlands. One problem with NWI though is that it's pretty static. So they did a one-time survey and it really hasn't been updated. So for our area here, most of the wetland information we have is from the early 1980s when they first did the inventory. They're just starting to redo some of it so they can look at some of the changes that have occurred, but it's a very slow process. It's not like some of the more real-time data you get from some of the satellites and all, but then again, a lot of them have resolution issues where they like Landsat's 30 meters and you miss a lot of those real small wetlands.
Yeah.
But
Um,
NWI is definitely it's used a lot because it's having at least, it does have its flaws, but having maps of all the wetlands out on the landscape is extremely valuable resource to have.
Interesting. And Sandy is wondering what level of confidence you have in the wetland inventory, or just in general, what level of confidence is there?
What level? Yeah, it really,
Uh,
depends on how recent the survey was, because they did it as they started in the prairie potholes because that was the area that had most value for waterfowl, and it was Fish and Wildlife Service that does the National Wetland Inventory, so that's where they started. They wanted to know what was going on with wetlands in the potholes, and but a consequence of that is our data is also the oldest, so that's why they're just starting to get to redo some of those surveys, and so you will find, a lot of in NWI, a lot of the wetlands in there have been drained and they're still showing up as wetlands, or there have been some huge expanses in the size of wetlands, in more recent years that we got into some real wet periods, started here in the southern prairies in about 1993, the southern Prairie Pothole region, where we've had really a change in climate and the amount of precipitation, and when that precipitation falls, it has filled these wetlands up to really high levels, and they've been maintained at that higher levels, and so they're much larger than what NWI shows. Same thing's been happening up in Canada. It was just delayed some, so it was until 2008 or so, I believe, that really the same increase in wetland size has started happening further north, but we do document some of that in actually a special issue of Wetland that came out on prairie pothole wetlands and climate change. That I can get information on that for anybody that wants to email me or whatever. It's just dmache@usgs.gov, and I can provide more information on that.
Perfect. Thank you for that answer. A listener named Michael is wondering if the type of vegetation around wetlands makes a difference in terms of the ecosystem services values. For example, weeds versus natural prairie vegetation. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, it definitely makes a big difference, and it all depends on the service you're looking at. Once again, we get back to those trade-offs. So, once you uh, we found up in Canada, there's some work that came out quite a while ago that shows some of the introduced species like smooth brome use a lot more of the water, and so they'll actually allow less of the water to flow off the landscape into the wetlands during the summer after those summer thunderstorm events and all, and they can lead to wetland drying, which definitely influences services that you'll get from the wetland. Cattails are a big problem. The invasive hybrid cattail. It's a hybrid between the native broadleaf cattail and the non-native short narrowleaf cattail, and they'll choke out wetlands. And they're great at storing carbon, but they're terrible in terms of providing habitat for waterfowl and other species because they just really choke out the wetland.
I didn't realize
So
that. That's so unfortunate.
yeah, whatever's going on. One thing we talk about delineating the edges of wetlands and all, but they're really tied to that upland area surrounding them. So that's just kind of an artificial line we put around wetlands. It's really a continuum going from the wetland up into the dryland habitat. And anything that happens up in that catchment in terms of changes to the vegetative community is going to have an ultimate effect on that wetland, because that water goes downhill and that wetland is sitting in the that depression, that low area on the landscape. And so anything that happens upstream from it usually ends up affecting it in terms of inputs of sediments or excess nutrients coming off of an ag field, or anything that you do with the vegetation around a wetland.
Absolutely. Yeah. The next question is from a listener named Glenn. He says that Ducks Unlimited is working to have existing marginal cropland around wetlands converted back to grasslands. Would you by chance have an estimate of carbon captured per hectare in this conversion? Do you know anything about that, or is that out of your scope?
No, that's in the InVEST model that we've developed. So we do have a way of calculating that. So if we have the area that is being worked on, or where those wetlands are being restored, or actually where the grasslands are being restored, you could run it through the InVEST model, and using the information that we have, that basically it converts different land cover types to amount of carbon that's being stored, and it will provide you that output. And so that's exactly what we did in the Des Moines lobe area that I showed you there. But I just used the Des Moines lobe for an example. We've also done that throughout the U.S. portion of the Prairie Pothole region, and it it could definitely be extended up into Canada using those same tables that we developed for down here.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Along the same lines, a listener named Gail is wondering if there's an application for this research for urban wetland areas.
Boy, that's a tough one, because
Mhm.
most of this is really focused on more either natural or agricultural lands, and urban wetlands are so artificial in terms of their water flows into them and out of them, and such, that it's really the work that we've been doing is really not um, designed for that, but some of the ideas could help guide how you might go about valuing services from urban wetlands. But the specific work we've done is really more focused on more natural and agricultural lands.
Okay, that makes sense. A listener named Kayla says, you showed quite a large scale model for Invest. Can it easily be scaled down to, the size of a square mile?
Yes, it definitely can.
Okay,
So it's just if you have the resolution of your landscape at that smaller scale, it's a GIS model and it will handle that just fine.
perfect. That's great.
That
And a
that's
listener
usually
named
we're usually going the opposite direction. We develop everything at that smaller scale, and we're trying to figure out, okay, now how can we scale this up to cover the broad region? So most of what
Yeah.
goes into InVEST was actually done at that smaller scale, even smaller than a square mile, down at that wetland catchment. What's going on in terms of that catchment level information,
Okay.
and that's the level that Apex runs at too, is a single wetland and a catchment.
Okay. Okay, perfect. And a listener named Davis is wondering, how can someone within a single watershed use some of these tools with their current state of development? And he mentions he's currently working in the Des Moines region, and watershed has unfortunately lost 90% of wetlands and 99.5% prairie.
Again, working at the watershed scale is ideal for both Invest and Apex. Especially Apex can tie into SWOT. So Apex models a single wetland basin and catchment, and then the SWOT model takes multiple, basically Apex runs, brings multiple wetlands together into the flowing system to look at downstream effects. But if you really go on to the InVEST site, again, back to that Natural Capital Projects webpage, they have a lot of demonstration work that was done at the catchment level, and a lot of it was done, outside of the United States and even outside of North America. A lot of the development work, and there's some neat models, examples like they show an area in Hawaii where it is a single drainage basin, and they show how deforestation in a certain area of that drainage basin might influence stream flows down, further down in the watershed. So we really were developing it to look more at that ecoregion scale on the prairies, but it's definitely can be scaled to just about any scale that you want to work at, and a watershed is an excellent scale, I would say, for doing InVEST runs.
Perfect. Perfect. And last question that we have here is from a listener named Glenn, and he says, where would I go to learn about the quantified economic impact of habitat on farm gate earnings? Do you have any recommendations?
I wish I did. That's one of the hardest things, and something that we really haven't done is put, putting a value on the habitat. There's been some earlier work done looking at like waterfowl, where they tie it to duck production and how the amount of money spent by hunters going out to harvest waterfowl are the amount of money spent for bird watchers if we're looking at things like grassland birds. But that's really something USGS hasn't got into. Really, the only thing we have put a dollar value on is carbon, because we have a value that we can pull from that the government currently uses to value release of, or the cost of releasing CO2 in the atmosphere. But putting a value on habitat is really tough, and not something that I have the expertise to really comment anymore on.
No problem, no problem. That's all the questions that we have today. One of our listeners, Gail, has typed in, thank you for a clear explanation of this exciting new modeling method. You are amplifying the voices of those working to protect the native prairies, so more people will listen and do something to protect the prairies. And I just want to reiterate her comment there. Thank you so much for the work that you're doing, and then for sharing it with us. And yeah, we really appreciate you taking the time to share such timely and relevant information. So thank you very, very much. And to all of our listeners out there, thank you so much for catching our first webinar of Prairie's Got the Goods Week. I would like to invite everyone to check out the PCAP website. We have a whole series of webinars going on this week, so hopefully everyone can join us for other webinars going on. So with that, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
And I do want to thank you for providing me the opportunity to present this.
More than welcome. It was our pleasure. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.